I'd like to thank Professor Vasco da Silva and the LP's Law Review for the opportunity. And I'd like to speak today about a very American institution, freedom of expression. Freedom of expression in the United States has been a source of inspiration for the European protection of the right. This is true in Europe in general. It is also true in Portugal. But freedom of expression in the United States, at least seen from Europe, is going through a moment of crisis, a moment of pressure. Richard Posner once made the historical reference that Spain, Portugal, or Italy have probably caused superior damage through the well-being of its peoples for suppressing scientific freedom instead of political freedom. It is true that freedom of expression, to the extent that protects scientific freedom and political freedom, has a broader meaning. Freedom of expression is not only political, it is not only protected because of politics or democracy. Freedom of expression is now facing three fundamental problems, and I'd like to briefly say a few words about each. So let me start with the first. Freedom of expression protects communication. It protects the manifestation of ideas. This is true historically in the Declaration of Rights in France in 1789. It is true in the major books and opinions about freedom of expression, from John Stuart Mill on liberty to the opinions of Justice Oliver Holmes. The historical component of freedom of expression can also be seen in the European Convention of Human Rights. So, communication of ideas is the core of freedom of expression, and many of the social types we associate with freedom of expression have to do with ideas, with the protection of ideas. The religious dissenter, or the political dissenter, the political activist, the man who is telling uncomfortable truths. All these are social, individual types we value, and we know that freedom of expression in a true democracy must necessarily protect them. Now, many of these social types are diametrically disappearing. There may be others emerging, but these types, the religious dissenter or the political activist or the political dissenter, seem to be disappearing. And here is a problem. Here is our problem. Free speech is no longer a freedom of ideas, and is no longer a freedom for ideas we dislike. This is a huge problem. freedom of expression is becoming conformist, is becoming emotional, it's becoming sentimental, is preferring silences to speech. I don't mean that silences are not protected, but certainly a silence is not the same thing as speech. So there's something here that is now missing. And what is now missing is that freedom of expression protects the uncomfortable. It protects ideas we dislike, and it protects ideas. And many of the forms of expression now being protected under freedom of expression have nothing to do with ideas. Nothing to do with ideas, no intellectual value whatsoever, no communicative value whatsoever. American law has, we know, or treats, as we know, campaign finance law in the realm of freedom of expression. But freedom of expression for us in Europe have nothing to do with the way parties spend money. This is something for us extremely strange. So it seems to that freedom of expression is becoming less intellectual, and this has certainly to do with what Frederick Schauer once qualified as the opportunism of the First Amendment, and that there are groups that actively pursue the protection of freedom of expression. This is true in the United States. It is true in Europe. The question is, should we be concerned with this or not? I believe we should. I believe that a system that is contributing to the erosion of the intellectual value of freedom of expression, that is creating difficulties for the ideas we dislike, the ideas that we find uncomfortable, is a deeply flawed system of freedom of expression. Now let me consider the second issue, the second problem. Now we know this is something we have learned from the United States. We know that freedom of expression is protected for many reasons. It is legally and constitutionally protected under many different sources of justification. We know that there is a political First Amendment and an ethical First Amendment and a cognitive First Amendment, and maybe many more. There is a problem with the fact that in many specific contexts, the idea of free communication is in a crisis. And it is in a crisis because we are increasingly fighting the free manifestations of speech in those specific contexts. This is true in the academia. This is true in the academia to extent that freedom of expression and freedom of research in the academia are being politicized and are being used clearly by political groups. This is true. It is very much surprising the fact that there is now an academic journal called the Journal for Controversial Ideas. This seems to be a manifestation of the crisis itself. It is also, to give another example, very a source of preoccupation, the fact that doctors are interviewed by newspapers. They give, let's say, an opinion about a controversial issue, social issue, and then they are liable for malpractice. These are just opinions. That's what we ask of doctors. These are opinions as experts. There is indeed a huge discomfort here with the fact that we don't seem at ease with freedom of expression in certain contexts. We want to politicize every form of speech. And we are looking at this in the United States. We are looking at this huge movement of politicization of speech in the US, and we need to be very careful. Finally, let me give you a note on the third problem, the third menace. One thing we learned also from the United States is that public discourse, public speech is often uncivil, aggressive, controversial, but immensely, let's say, immensely not exactly quiet. We know that many of the forms of expression we protect are not exactly forms of respect. We know this in politics or in the press or in social platforms. The whole doctrine for public figures or public contexts have to do with the protection of forms of uncivil behavior and uncivil communication. This is what Justice Brennan said. And this is true in the United States. It is also true in Europe. Now, 40 and 50 years ago, let's say in Europe, freedom of expression was limited by general clauses of decency, respect, and even good manners. Nobody uses these general clauses anymore. Nobody uses decency or good manners as limitation for freedom of expression. Nobody uses this normative criteria to understand what is valid and what is acceptable in terms of freedom of expression. And there's a paradox. And the most important constitutionalists in the United States have, I think, analyzed this paradox. And the paradox is that while we protect strongly forms of expression that are aggressive and unrespectful, and specifically in political contexts, these seem to contribute to a certain erosion of the social cohesion of a certain society. To the extent that we protect forms of speech that are non-respectful, and non-respectful with respect to with social norms, these seem to affect the social discipline of a certain society. In many countries in Europe, communication and speech are subject to what we frame as respect, as the law of respect. This is something that Professor James Whitman has written about. And there is indeed a huge tension between public discourse and respect. In Portugal, it is a crime to offend the honor of the president, for example. It is a crime. And certainly this is a norm that has to do with the protection of respect. Now, here is the problem. We are in a moment where the norms that used to define respect are being forgotten. And the question is, what do we have to fill that hole? What do we have when, okay, we are now in a system where we essentially protect attacks to religion or attacks to institutions and attacks to the ancient forms of respect. Okay, we protect them, but the question is, what do we exactly now put in the place of respect? And I think the alternative in Europe, and this is where actually it seems that Europe is in a moment of probably influencing the United States, is that the alternative we have is hate speech. And the alternative we have is hate crimes. And it seems that the reference for regulating speech in our societies is increasingly hate. So speech that communicates hate should be banned, should be forbidden. Now, hate is a problem, of course, but the replacement of respect by hate is a problem, And I think that hate speech, and one of the reasons why the Americans have been so suspicious about hate speech is that they understood that hate speech has a chilling effect. So the fact that we are now relying on speech instead of, or on hate instead of respect, doesn't seem to be a positive evolution of freedom of expression. So these are three problems affecting freedom of expression in the world today. And this is true in the United States. It is also true in Europe. Thank you very much.